It's been 6 years since cannabis was legalized in Canada, and our country was one of the first in the world to provide legal and regulated access to cannabis for non-medical purposes. Many applauded the move. Others worried that we were embarking on a dangerous social experiment. Even before legalization, the rate of cannabis use more than doubled from 1985 to 2017, from 6% to 15%. Statistics Canada reports that cannabis use has also increased since legalization, but that the pandemic may be the culprit. As routines changed and stress rose, people may have turned to recreational drugs for relief. Time will tell whether these rates continue to rise and what it means for our health and well-being. To help us navigate the evolving research on cannabis and weed out the misinformation, we're joined by ICES scientist Dr. Daniel Myran, a family doctor who studies the societal impact of substance use.
I think there's a couple major questions that we have about cannabis and its health impacts. And I think probably the largest one, and it's actually a well-researched area, is whether or not cannabis use can cause psychosis and schizophrenia.
Welcome to In Our Voices, the podcast that takes you beyond the data to meet the people and hear the stories that help shape health and healthcare for all of us. I'm your host, Misty Pratt, and I'm one of the people behind the data who make the difference at ICES, a health research, data, and analytics institute based in Ontario, Canada. ICES staff, scientists, and partners are on a mission to make healthcare better and people healthier. In this podcast, we share our stories in our voices. A note that the opinions expressed in this podcast don't necessarily reflect those of ICES. Dr. Daniel Myran, welcome to In Our Voices.
Thanks for having me on the podcast.
Thank you for being here. I want to start with your Canada Research Chair in Social Accountability at the University of Ottawa. Can you tell us what social accountability means?
So broadly, social accountability is the idea that the research that we do should both involve the communities that are impacted by it and ensure that it's relevant to the needs, health concerns, and essentially problems that are impacting those communities. I interpret that in two ways. So first, I look at substance use as an issue that is broadly having an enormous health impact on Canadians and, closer to home here in Ontario. It's also a very large issue. And as an area of research that we urgently need more evidence on about what are the impacts of substance use, what are the policies that can be put in place to mitigate some of those harms and disparities. And then a second piece of social accountability research is how do you ensure that the research that you're doing involves people who are relevant to it? So that's the communities who are impacted, that's the decision makers who will go on to use your research, and both those streams move together to ensure, hopefully, that the research that's done is impactful and relevant to people.
So if we're talking about recreational drug use, how would we involve that population in the research?
I think it's really interesting to think about how do you involve people. And I find that, the voices and the perspectives that they bring are really, really helpful for understanding a lot of stuff that, even as a clinician, you may not be aware of the details of. So, interacting with people, you understand what types of products they're attracted to, how they're using products. And those actually give you a lot of insight into, what is popular and what may be associated with harm. And then also, as part of the social accountability lens, it involves impacted communities and individuals, but also the decision makers and regulators. So a lot of the work is about saying, we're doing research on this particular policy and speaking to people at Health Canada or speaking to people at the Ministry of Health and saying, what do you need to know about? What are the things that would help you in your decision-making or regulatory choices? And that often helps us pick topics that, it doesn't change the direction of what we look at, but it helps us decide, this is something that's really important to them and they're thinking about making a decision on. Let's do research in this area to help bring evidence to the gap that's there.
So you're kind of letting people in the community decide a little bit what is important to them.
Because we're the data experts. We know how to work the data. We know how to, we know what the data has. We know its challenges. We know its strengths. And we don't always know what someone is thinking about making a change on. Mm-hmm. Are they thinking about changing the types of products that can be on the market? Or are they interested more in marketing regulations? Are they interested in poisonings in young children? Are they interested in episodes of psychosis in young adults? And all of those questions can help you say, what's a priority? What do we need evidence for?
What inspired you to conduct research in this area?
Much of it is related to timing of, when I finish med school, when I finish up my training. And it just so happens that I finish up my a master's of public health as part of my public health training right as legalization is coming out. And I actually started in alcohol control policy. So my master's of public health was looking at evaluating what happened to emergency room visits involving alcohol after the government of Ontario introduced alcohol sales in grocery stores. And I used health administrative data to say, did emergency room visits change more in regions that got a grocery store that began to sell alcohol than those that didn't? And it felt like a very natural next step to start looking at cannabis legalization and cannabis policy, because actually many of the features that you have evidence for from alcohol about what impacts how much alcohol is used, what causes alcohol harms to be higher or lower, have many parallels for cannabis. So you end up saying, we think that price will be really important. We think that marketing will be important. We think that the availability of stores will be important, but we don't know because no one's done this for cannabis yet. So let's take that evidence base and let's apply it to legalization as it unfolds to evaluate it.
And how did you feel when cannabis was legalized?
So I actually wrote an op-ed at the start, right around the time that legalization was happening, cautioning that there is a lot of nuance to legalization. We often say that it's often conceived as a binary yes-no event. You legalize cannabis or you don't legalize cannabis, but there are many different variations in how it can be legalized and in the implementation. And those have actually happened across the country. If you look at the different provinces, there's many, many different forms that it's taken. But at the onset of legalization, I was pro the decriminalization of cannabis and removing the criminal justice harms, which are broad, completely inequitably distributed in society, falling mostly on Black and Indigenous Canadians. And were they were a major public health harm that happens. And I was very pro removing those criminal records, those criminal challenges. But I was very concerned that we would end up with a very commercialized cannabis industry. And what I mean by that is a system where the sale of cannabis became very oriented towards making large amounts of money for corporations, and that you would move from the idea of saying, we're legalizing this, but we want to ensure that as few young people are using it as possible, and that there isn't a lot of marketing, and that the products that are on the market are aimed towards being less harmful products, to instead the focus being on, again, making a lot of money, attracting users of cannabis and getting and growing a market. And I think that as we have ended out, as the market has evolved, as our legalization process has evolved and matured, that we've ended up much towards that commercial side than public health individuals would have wanted. And I think that is optimal for people's health.
And with commercialization comes probably a greater use of cannabis. And so a lot of people talk these days about the health benefits that, might be beneficial for sleep or chronic pain or for cancer patients as well. Cannabis has a very long history of human use, and there are a lot of health claims made about the benefits of cannabis. Are they backed by science?
I think the way cannabis rolled out in Canada is really interesting because we, of course, had medical cannabis legalization and then a decent increase in access to medical cannabis before we legalized cannabis for non-medical or recreational purposes. And as part of the lead up to non-medical legalization, there was an increasing idea that cannabis can act as a medicine and that it can have benefits for a variety of conditions. It's not my role. It's never my job to say, you have individually not benefited from this. So for people who say that cannabis is really wonderful for my sleep, or I find that my osteoarthritis is much better managed, or I feel less anxious when I take it, I'm happy that they're feeling that they're benefiting from it. The evidence base for it as a medicine is not fantastic. When you look at these large reviews of what happens with cannabis for a variety of conditions, there isn't strong evidence as a sleep aid. There is not strong evidence for it being particularly effective for pain. It ends up being a second or third line agent that you would try after you've tried other things first, and for which people get a very small reduction in pain if it does work for them, and have an almost equal risk of side effects like being drowsy or feeling not enjoying the experience of taking it. There's a small number of very specific things for which it's ended up having reasonable evidence for: rare pediatric seizure disorders, for muscle spasticity in people who have multiple sclerosis. But at the end of the day, I don't think that the body of evidence has come out saying that this is supporting a lot of the claims that have been made for it as a silver bullet drug or therapeutic that would improve a lot of things.
Do you think we'll ever get to the point where the evidence is more definitive for certain conditions?
So this is absolutely not my area of expertise. I think that one of the challenges that people who are really interested in the therapeutic uses of it is that after non-medical legalization in Canada, many people who are interested in using it for medical reasons switched over to acquiring it from the non-medical market because it became easier, potentially cheaper, and that there have been, again, my understanding is that there have been a lot more hurdles for getting drug trials out of the way, and maybe less of an interest in running drug trials once it's now, again, if you think about, if you have a very large non-medical market and people can access it fairly easily, there isn't always the need to run a drug trial, which can be expensive and time consuming. So I think there's been challenges building that evidence base that people are looking for here. I don't know what the long-term data will show. I think for many of the promised health benefits like pain and sleep, I'm not convinced that you need that much more data. Kind of the evidence is in, and I don't think that running more trials are going to tell us suddenly that this is much better for pain relief than we currently see it as.
And what are some of the key health impacts of cannabis use that are currently under-researched?
I think there's a couple major questions that we have about cannabis and its health impacts. And I think probably the largest one, and it's actually a well-researched area, is whether or not cannabis use can cause psychosis and schizophrenia. And there have been many, many studies, and interest in this dates back actually hundreds of years. You have case reports, in old, stuffy British medical journals about people who develop, psychosis or schizophrenia after using cannabis. So this is not a new idea, but there has been an ongoing debate in the literature about whether it's a causal association. So essentially, are there individuals who, after using cannabis, will develop schizophrenia who otherwise would not have? If they had not used cannabis, they never would have developed schizophrenia. And it's not a settled question. People are starting to use pretty innovative new approaches to get to the bottom of the question. And I think that there is, to my mind, there's pretty compelling evidence that some of the association is causal, that there are some individuals who probably develop schizophrenia from using cannabis who wouldn't have otherwise. But I also think that some of the association that we see in the epi literature is related to confounding. So other factors that both increase the risk of schizophrenia and make people more likely to use cannabis.
So confounding, meaning if somebody perhaps was already feeling anxious or having other mental health symptoms, maybe they're using cannabis to treat those symptoms on their own? So
there's three ideas, right? You look at this epi association between cannabis use and schizophrenia. The first idea is there's a causal component, right? This is really causing schizophrenia in some individuals. The second idea is confounding, and that's thought to be from either shared genetic factors. So for example, you have a series of genes that predispose you towards schizophrenia, and they also happen to make you more likely to use cannabis, or an environmental or lifestyle risk factor. So maybe you had a series of adverse childhood experiences, and those we know increase your risk of having schizophrenia later on, and probably increase your risk of heavy cannabis use later in life. And then the third one that you were highlighting is what's called reverse causation. So the idea is that you have someone who has early symptoms of psychosis or schizophrenia. Maybe they're becoming slightly paranoid. They are having some hallucinations, and they're quite distressed or anxious about it because people would be, and they have heard that cannabis might be good for anxiety. So they start medicating the symptoms or trying to medicate the symptoms of it with cannabis. So even though it seems like there will be a strong association between the cannabis use and schizophrenia, it wasn't causal. It was actually that person just medicating something that was already starting to unfold or happen.
Yeah, and I can see how that would be really hard to tease apart.
And there have been, people are doing clever studies, and again, the clever designs than what I do. So you have really interesting studies where you have everyone's genetics sequenced, right? And you figure out, so you have everyone's genome and you've got, everything's been sequenced. You know the genes that are associated with schizophrenia, and you can see the genes associated with cannabis use. And then you have additional data about people's cannabis use and who develops schizophrenia. And many of those studies are continuing to show that even adjusting for genetics, you see this association persists. And there's been other studies where people have said, let's look at the timing of when people use cannabis and when symptoms of psychosis began. And again, you see that there is a pretty strong association between cannabis use and psychosis, but not a very good association between psychosis and cannabis use. So maybe less evidence for the idea of self-medication.
So other than the genetic piece, are there characteristics that of certain populations that would perhaps put them at a greater risk?
For both cannabis use and schizophrenia?
Yes.
One of the strongest predictors for psychosis and schizophrenia is family history, because it is, very genetically related. The other factors seem to be is that younger age and male sex are both pretty strong risk factors, both for heavy cannabis use and for schizophrenia.
And you may not know the answer to this, but why would it be males? Why is there something there genetic-wise or biological?
Again, we're stretching my expertise, but my understanding of what is commonly thought of is that because of sex differences in how the brain matures and how neural connectivity stops being as plastic or changeable, is that a male brain is more vulnerable. And again, this is the hypothesis, is that a male brain is more vulnerable to adverse changes from cannabis use because it has less cortical maturity early on. So you have during the window that you're going to get exposed to a heavy amount of cannabis use or potentially exposed to that, female brains are often more matured and less susceptible to it, and male brains are still in a vulnerable window or period.
Okay, fascinating.
I think another area that our research has looked at that hasn't been able to be done in the same way is looking at a condition called cannabis hyperemesis syndrome. And this is a disorder where people who use cannabis daily or almost every day, and particularly for higher strength or higher THC products, develop very severe nausea and vomiting. And many of these individuals actually end up in the emergency room. They don't understand what's happening. They come in with very bad stomach pain. And one of the hallmarks is that their symptoms actually improve with hot water. Like they might be taking an hour-long hot shower to try and get relief from their symptoms. And it's historically been very rare. There hasn't been, it was kind of, again, it's in the case report kind of thing 20 years ago. And what we saw in our study is that it's really increased quite rapidly over time in Ontario, that you have very large increases in the number of people who are coming in with this condition, that it seems to accelerate after the legal market in Ontario commercializes. So in early 2020, the market moves from only having a very small number of stores and having restrictions on the type of products that can be sold. So you only had dried cannabis flower. And then in early 2020, you had vapes with THC and concentrates, which is THC that's been, put into very, very high concentrations through processing. Those products come to market, and you see a pretty large immediate jump in people coming in with cannabis hyperemesis. And it's all quite consistent with data about the growing number of people who use cannabis daily or near daily in Canada, along with the rising THC potency of products. So to put it in context, the cannabis that people would have been familiar with in the 1970s has 1 or 2% THC in dried flower. And that rises to around 4% by the early 1990s. And then data is showing that it's up to around 10 or 12% by like 2010. And the products that are on, like the average THC content of dried flower that you would go into a store and purchase from across the country right now is 25%. So, this is a very, very different drug or substance than from what people are used to or think of if they had experiences with it in the 70s or early, even, in the 2010s. And, in the literature about the association between cannabis and addiction and cannabis and psychosis and cannabis and some of the adverse mental health harms, ultra high potency cannabis is defined as anything with 10% or more THC. So the stuff that we have on the market is very, very different and much more concentrated than what people have evidence for and what people have studied in the past. And it's all like it really does seem to have come together for some of the conditions that we're worried about, like cannabis hyperemesis or cannabis-induced psychosis.
Yeah, because I've seen some of the products at 10% be marketed as low THC.
10%, like, if 20 years ago, that would have been an unthinkable product. And it would have, in the literature, I looked at that as something as like a very high potency, high risk product. So again, the stuff that has been created and is on the market is just very, very different. And we're actually now up against some of the theoretical limits of what THC content you can get into dried flower. And one of the trends that seems to be happening is that you're now moving into pre-rolled cannabis products, which has dried flower, but then it has processed concentrates that are dried up and sprinkled in to move past that limit of what you can put in. And I think that this is one of the real challenges with commercialization, that we have ended up with products that are becoming potentially more and more risky. And there's an irony that I think the risks of some of the cannabis products that are on the market right now are higher than they've ever been at an exact time that society's conception of the risk of cannabis is at an all-time low. And again, there was like reefer madness in the 70s where cannabis was not actually that risky. And now we're saying that cannabis is innocuous or perhaps a medicine. And it's actually evolved to be quite distinct and perhaps now truly is a much more risky substance.
We're coming up to the holidays when many people will be kicking back with a cannabis gummy or their favorite alcoholic drink. How receptive are people to hearing about health risks?
I think it really depends on the health risk and on the person. One of the interesting policy pieces has been the health warnings that are put on cannabis products in this country. And, Health Canada actually is going through a series of revising them. They've revised them before, they're revising them again right now. And a lot of the challenges that they've had is that some of the health warnings that they want to put on cannabis are not always believed by people who are using cannabis. I think that broadly, we've done studies about treatment for cannabis use disorders during pregnancy and how that changed after legalization, and whether or not requiring treatment for cannabis use during pregnancy was associated with problems with the babies born to people who used cannabis. And I think generally people find that sort of evidence fairly believable, with lots of people saying, yeah, this is probably not a great thing to be using during pregnancy. But again, there's a subset of people who really, they're not as receptive to that messaging. There's a lot of individuals who are interested in using cannabis during pregnancy for control of morning sickness. And again, these are very hard and challenging conversations. And, the evidence is, we don't have causal evidence saying that if you use cannabis during pregnancy, that it increases the risk of babies being smaller or babies being diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder or ADHD when they're, 5 or 6. There's concerning associations, but it's hard to communicate the degree of certainty that people are looking for. And if you think about tobacco, when we communicate about tobacco, for example, there's no problem saying tobacco causes lung cancer. Tobacco increases your risk of heart disease. Because the evidence base for cannabis is not as advanced as it is for tobacco, it often makes the communication more challenging.
Are there any other health risks that your research has found?
I talked about schizophrenia and psychosis as one of the areas that we were looking at and focusing on. The other big areas that we've monitored and been interested in is poisonings in young children. So we've done studies looking at whether kids under the age of 9 have had increases in hospitalizations or emergency room visits from cannabis. And what we found is that there were very, very large increases in the country. We did a study where we compared poisoning hospitalizations in Ontario, Alberta, and British Columbia, all of which allowed legal cannabis edibles to come to market, and compared them to changes in Quebec, who didn't allow edibles to come to market because they were concerned that they would be very appealing to young children. And we found that after legalization and when the edibles come out, you have a 7-fold increase in hospitalizations. They're 7 times higher in kids age 0 to 9. And in Quebec, they only go up by 2-fold or 2 times. So very large increases in child poisonings. They're fortunately quite rare. When we did a study spanning, I think it was 7 years, there were just over 500 hospitalizations in children for cannabis poisonings. I'm not a pediatric toxicologist, but colleagues who I worked with on the study are. They see young children who go to the ICU because they have stopped breathing from a cannabis ingestion. And if they had not been ventilated in the ICU, would have died. So they can be quite severe. And what's interesting is that the THC limit that we currently have in legal edibles in Canada is right at the point of toxicity for young children. So you have a single gummy or piece of candy is not allowed to have more than 10 milligrams of THC in it. And it just so happens that if a young child eats 2 or 3 pieces of those, that is enough for them to potentially need hospitalization. So young kids are very, very susceptible to these. And it's been, I think, a concerning thing to see from the toxicity. And again, when you see kids with these hospitalizations, it's probably just the tip of the problem. So for every kid who shows up in Emerge who's been, or Emerge or hospitalized for a poisoning, there's potentially more kids who had a smaller ingestion that didn't show up.
So what would you say to parents about that?
I think that there has been better communication about this, but cannabis needs to be treated like a medicine and a toxic medicine. So the places where, people who might have opioids or benzodiazepines or heart medications, all of which can be very dangerous for kids to ingest, cannabis needs to be treated in the same way. So, ideally in a locked place. Part of the problem that is likely occurring with cannabis is that these products are incredibly appealing, that once they are out of their packaging, they are indistinguishable from candy and chocolate because they are candy and chocolate. And again, I was talking at the start of the podcast about commercialization. And it is my honest view that there is absolutely no reason to have the legal sale of highly appealing candies that contain cannabis, that adult consumers can have a wide variety of other ways that they can get cannabis, and that this is just not a product that needs to exist. And I agree, it exists on the remaining illicit market. And I think that there's societal problems of just saying that any product that exists for sale illegally should also be offered for sale legally.
How can data like that held at ICES inform better policy and education about cannabis use?
I think what's so unique about ICS data is that it's at the population level. So we're really capturing healthcare visits for everyone in Ontario, and that it's linked so that you can follow people over time. You can understand their healthcare history at a point in time, and then you can follow them forwards. And I'll give you 2 examples. So one, there's been studies before about whether people who have an episode of cannabis-induced psychosis, so this is someone who shows up in Emerge, they've consumed cannabis, and they're having hallucinations or paranoia, and the treating team thinks that it's linked to the cannabis use. And there'd been very small studies before about that, but because we have, the huge ICS link data, we can do studies where we look at that association and we look at it for men and women and for people of different ages. And for example, one of the things that we found was that someone who shows up in the emergency room for cannabis-induced psychosis has never received healthcare before for schizophrenia. Within the next 3 years, 26% of them will be diagnosed with schizophrenia. And amongst men aged 15 to 24, it's 40% will be diagnosed with schizophrenia, almost half. And to me, it identifies a group who absolutely needs very close monitoring, further intervention. And the health system should be thinking about it. These are, we have specialized first episode psychosis programs where people who come in to emerge with psychosis are followed up and treated. And I think this is a group of individuals who should be urgently sent into those first episode psychosis programs.
What are you working on now?
We're doing a couple of different projects right now. One of the areas that I'm quite interested in is related to psychedelics or hallucinogens. There's been a lot of interest in psychedelics, and particularly arising from trials of psychedelic-assisted therapy, where people with a couple of different mental health conditions, including substance use disorders, post-traumatic stress disorder, treatment-resistant depression, receive a psychedelic like magic mushrooms or psilocybin combined with therapy or counseling. And there's some data showing that it may be effective in those conditions. And along with those trials, there has just been this absolute surge of public interest in hallucinogens and psychedelics. And we don't have wonderful data in Canada, but data from the US is showing that, this is doubled or tripled amongst adults in the last 8 years. I think the latest estimate was that 10% of people aged 18 to 30 in the US had used a hallucinogen in the past year. So a very large segment of the population is now using these, and we have almost no data on their health effects. As many gaps as there are for cannabis, the gaps for hallucinogens are much, much higher. So I think we're interested in understanding what are some of the associations between hallucinogen use and health harms. And then from a regulatory perspective and from a policy perspective, how is use in visits related to hallucinogens changing over time in the country? And there's many similarities between hallucinogens and, what's happened with cannabis, and there's many distinctions. And I think it's interesting to bring this data to help inform some of the policy debates that are going on about whether or not this should be legalized for recreational or non-medical use, and inform some of the clinical decisions that are happening about whether, what are some of the potential safety signals that might happen for people who use this in medical settings, and is this as safe as some of the trials are saying hallucinogen or psychedelic uses?
Do you see legalization coming for psychedelics?
I think that, to me, when I think about this, is that right now, again, it feels like our societal conversation is conflating these two. That we're saying, medical uses of psychedelics and recreational use are often discussed as a similar thing. We should make this legal and available because it has medical purposes. And these are conversations that should absolutely not be conflated. I think that there is an urgent need to generate high quality evidence about the medical uses of these, and for medical use of this to occur in a way that's accessible for people who would benefit from it, in a way that's regulated and prescribed, because, again, the populations that we're talking about who may benefit from this generally have quite severe pre-existing mental health conditions. And you want a trained healthcare provider with experience to be there, helping to decide who would benefit, helping to monitor for adverse effects. And then the other piece where we say, there's an interest in legalizing this for recreational or non-medical use, that's a very important and reasonable societal conversation. But it should not be, we're doing this for medical reasons. We're doing this to benefit people's mental health or well-being. It should be a conversation about, we're doing this because we believe as a value of people's, civil liberties, that this should be a drug that can be consumed by people who want to. And I worry that those two debates are often lumped together and that we're conflating the two ideas and may end up with, and I don't think you end up with good drug policy for either sides if you mix those together.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, we have to leave it there for now, but I just want to thank you so much for being here. This was really informative and fascinating.
Well, thanks for having me.
To learn more about Dr. Myran's research, visit our website at ices.on.ca and navigate to the publications page. There, you can search by topic or by scientist. We'll also link to all the research that Dr. Myran referenced in our show notes. Thanks for joining me for this episode of In Our Voices. Please be sure to follow and rate us on your favorite podcast app. If you have feedback or questions about anything you've heard on In Our Voices, please email us at communications@ices.on.ca, and we'll be sure to get back to you. We might even share your feedback on a future episode. I'm Misty Pratt and wishing you strong data and good health.